I'm going to guess that you've heard of a psychopath or a sociopath. In this video, we're going to be covering all things antisocial personality disorder, including the diagnostic criteria and the stigma that surrounds the diagnosis. Not only that, but I'll tell you why I thought about not including psychopathy and sociopathy in the video. Make sure you watch until the end so you don't miss any of that information. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. But first, my name is Keegan. I have a master's degree in counseling and I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor. Keep in mind that engaging with this channel does not constitute a therapist-client relationship. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes. This does not substitute or replace professional mental health care. You'll find antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD for short, in two different categories of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition text revision. You'll find it under the disruptive, impulse control, and conduct disorders category, as well as this main category, which is personality disorders. Overall, this is a diagnosis where one of the core features is a lack of respect for the rights of others, and where the person will struggle to abide by rules, laws, and other pro-social behaviors. ASPD will usually begin to show up in childhood, with the age of onset usually beginning around the age of 9 years old. However, the diagnosis is not fully formed and present until late teens or early 20s, and it can't officially be diagnosed until the person is 18 or older. Generally, ASPD is a lifelong diagnosis. However, symptoms can improve with age and in some cases even remit. Before we dive in more, we should address the stigma that surrounds antisocial personality disorder. ASPD is a highly stigmatized diagnosis. Imagine this. You're told that you're going to meet with somebody who's a psychopath, and this is all you know about them. What thoughts would be on your mind? Maybe you think that they're going to be cold and uncaring. Perhaps that they're going to lack emotion, or maybe your thoughts are even going to the more extreme, that you're not going to be safe. Considering the thoughts that go through your mind as you think about this, you might start to notice some of the stigma and bias that exists for you related to ASPD. Some of the things that I mentioned that might be on your mind are going to be some of those thoughts that people often notice around this diagnosis, even though those are not necessarily true. We'll talk about psychopathy and sociopathy more in a bit, but these terms no longer exist at a diagnostic level. However, some do consider them to be subcategories of ASPD. That said, somebody with ASPD is not necessarily a psychopath or a sociopath, and in fact, they are likely not either of those. We have to be careful not to judge people based on what we think about these terms, how we've seen them portrayed in the media, or because of fears that we hold. Instead, we have to remember that we're talking about this at a technical, diagnostic level. Therefore, considering movies or shows where we've seen these things portrayed is likely not going to help us and instead likely going to lead us astray. Instead, remember that antisocial personality disorder is a mental health condition and that this is influencing the person's behavior. Perhaps consider that they have had experiences in life that might be influencing how they see and interact with the world. And remember to challenge your biases, recognize them when they exist, and set them aside. Of course, if we are working with somebody with a long-standing history of unlawful behavior, we want to be careful not to excuse or approve of those actions. We should also be careful to protect our own safety no matter what the circumstances are. But that's especially the case if we are working with somebody that we know has a history of being violent toward others. With all that said, let's take a look at the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. The first criteria is that the person must show a disregard for the rights of others, which can include violating the rights of others. This behavior must begin before the age of 15, and the person must show at least 3 of the following. First, they may not conform to lawful behaviors or similar social norms, and they may engage in behaviors that could be grounds for arrest. Keep in mind though that they do not actually need to be arrested or have legal involvement. Rather, if they're doing something that could get them arrested or could result in legal involvement, those would meet criteria here. Second, the person acts in ways that are for personal pleasure or profit that could include lying, conning, or being deceitful. They may even have an alias to try to accomplish this. These acts may be performed to gain money, power, or sex as examples. Third, they may fail to plan ahead or otherwise act impulsively. This may show up as them making a decision in the heat of the moment without considering the consequences of their behavior. Some of the ways that this is often going to show up is related to jobs, such as quitting a job abruptly or suddenly starting or ending relationships. Fourth, the client may have been in multiple physical fights, they may be aggressive or irritable. Keep in mind that if the physical altercation is meant to defend themselves, that would not meet criteria here. These behaviors may involve a romantic partner or a child. Fifth, they may disregard or not consider the safety of themselves or others. This could include high-risk substance use, high-risk sexual behaviors, or driving while under the influence as a few examples. The neglect of children would also fit into this category. Sixth, the client may repeatedly behave in ways that are irresponsible. Common areas where this will show up is related to finances or work. Acts of irresponsibility might include abandoning a job, having lengthy periods of unemployment even though work is available, or not paying their debts or child support. The last and seventh criteria is that they may show a lack of remorse. In situations where the client may have stolen from somebody, mistreated someone, or otherwise hurt another person, they may overall be indifferent to this. In some cases, they may rationalize their behavior or minimize what they've done. They may try to explain what happened as it being the fault of the other person, such as the victim being careless in some way. For somebody to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, they must be 18 years or older. If they're under the age of 18, other diagnoses should be considered instead, such as conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. Speaking of conduct disorder, for somebody to be diagnosed with ASPD, they must show evidence of conduct disorder before the age of 15. In some cases, the person may have been diagnosed with conduct disorder prior to that age. However, in many cases, this is going to involve the clinician going in and trying to figure out what was happening at those points in the person's life to see if they would have met criteria before the age of 15. Finally, we need to be mindful of what might actually be driving or initiating these behaviors that appear antisocial. For example, if the person's behaviors are because of another mental health diagnosis, specifically schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder may not be appropriate. So that's the diagnostic criteria for ASPD. Now let's cover some of the risk factors as well as what makes up psychopathy and sociopathy. But first, if you're enjoying this video and finding it helpful, please help me out by giving it a like and subscribing. There are a few different risk factors that are common with ASPD. Keep in mind that when we talk about risk factors, those factors do not mean that the person will get the diagnosis. Instead, risk factors mean that the person's chances of getting that diagnosis are more likely. However, it's possible for somebody to have no risk factors for a diagnosis and develop it at some point in life anyway. Likewise, somebody could have all of the risk factors for a diagnosis and never develop it. For ASPD, there are two key risk factors that we should discuss. The first is related to environment. For those who are abused or neglected as children, they are more likely to develop a conduct disorder, and that conduct disorder could then progress into ASPD. Second, as with many mental health diagnoses, ASPD seems to have a genetic factor as well. Specifically, somebody who has a parent with ASPD has an increased risk of developing this diagnosis themselves. As we see with many mental health conditions, these exist on a spectrum of severity, meaning that we're going to see some cases of ASPD that are more extreme and others that are less severe. At earlier points in time, psychopathy and sociopathy were used to describe specific types of ASPD. Nowadays, these terms have largely fallen out of use and are not used in the DSM anymore. Some people do still use these terms to refer to certain subtypes of ASPD, and they're both often seen as more extreme forms of the diagnosis. While researching and writing this video, I had considered not discussing psychopathy or sociopathy as part of this video, and that's because they're not widely used and are heavily stigmatized. However, I ultimately decided to include them in this video because I think that they can help understand some of the variability that we see in an ASPD diagnosis. So let's discuss some of the distinctions that exist between psychopathy and sociopathy, as these can help us understand some of the different ways that ASPD may present. In both cases, the person meets criteria for ASPD. With psychopathy, they're more likely to lack social skills. They might be more violent, but also more methodical. They're more likely to struggle to maintain relationships and be alone. They may lack guilt, even in situations where they have hurt a family member. For sociopathy, they tend to be more socially skilled. While they may present in a manner that is more socially acceptable, this can be superficial. They might not necessarily be violent, but they can be more likely to act impulsively or to act opportunistically. These individuals may be more apt for risk-taking behaviors. To reiterate though, psychopathy and sociopathy are not formally recognized in the DSM. Rather, there's a group of people that view ASPD as the overall diagnostic category, and they view psychopathy and sociopathy as subcategories of the diagnosis, where some people are not going to fit into either of those subcategories, but will still be in the ASPD diagnostic category. That's an overview of antisocial personality disorder. What other questions do you have about this diagnosis? Let me know in the comments. I hope that you found this video helpful. While you're here, check out some of the other videos on my channel. Thank you so much for watching.